Yo, what is up, guys? Snap here. Today we're going to be going over all of the last Epoch builds we're going to be playing for the 1.1 Harbingers of Ruin expansion. We got support builds, we got a few potential carry builds that you might want to check out. There is a lot to go over, so if you want to see one particular build or topic, just look at the timestamps. They'll be down in the description there, but let's jump right into it. So first things first, our composition we're going to be running for the 1.1 expansion is going to be 2 supports and 2 carries, similar to what we ended on in the 1.0 cycle. The 2 supports, of course, being a Paladin here, which looks like this, and then also a Void Knight, which looks very similar, but has a slight variation on it. And then as for the 2 carries, we are going to be playing the same build, and that is going to be a mana stacking Sorcerer. If you're unaware, in the patch notes, Sorcerer got a huge laundry list of just straight buffs, honestly, and it took an already pretty powerful build, I think, over the edge. I think mana stacking is going to be one of the top meta builds in the 1.1 patch. There'll be a few different variations. You're going to see some that take advantage of spark charges, some that try and go like cast on crit meteor. There's a lot of options on Sorcerer, but at the end of the day, the name of the game is just mana stacking. I also want to shout out Chunky Papa here. He made a mana stacker in the 1.0 cycle, and I have shamelessly ripped off this build and just made some modifications that you can play it in a group, and also have adjusted some things for the new patch, which I think make it more suitable for the new patch, as well as obviously accommodations for having supports in the group. But yeah, if you want to see how this build kind of plays in monoliths and bosses, there's some good footage. I would definitely go to check out Chunky Papa here. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. So let's start off with the carry build here, and that is going to be a mana stacker. Now the mana is all the way up at 2400, and there are a lot of ways you can leverage this for offense and defense. So let's go over all of those here now. But first off, the single target damage all comes from Static Orb, and there are 2 nodes that contribute to this. The nodes here, Mana Charge, give you more damage per 20 max mana, and then separate from that, there's another node which gives you more hit damage per mana cost of the skill. This node over here makes the skill cost a fixed 20% of your max mana, so you have 2 giant more multipliers that you can leverage by just stacking a bunch of max mana. The multipliers at play here when you have 2,400 mana are just ridiculous. This one node alone is giving you something like 1,000% more damage, and this other node is honestly giving you something like 1,200% more damage as well. Also a pretty crazy node down here which gives you 100% crit multi. This skill is just crazy. It just vaporizes anything that gets hit by it. Now, other ways this build leverages max mana comes from the boots here. Transient Rest is just crazy. When you have 2,400 mana, 60% of your current mana is gained as ward when you stop moving. This is something like 1,300 or 1,400 ward when you stop moving, which is constantly proccing if you're stutter stepping, as well as the experimental mod, which gives you ward per 10 missing mana when you use a traversal skill. This also counts against your negative mana, so if you've overcast your mana and you go negative and you cast focus to get your mana back while turning it into a traversal skill, you can get something like instant 7k ward, which is a lot. Additionally, there is a heavy focus on mana spent gained as ward, especially with these new nodes introduced here. You get 50% on the tree here. You can get another 50% on a T5 affix on the wand, and you also have an additional 36% on each of the Joras, which get tripled when you teleport. You have something like 300% mana spent gained as ward, which means if you dump your whole mana bar after teleporting, you can get something like another additional 7k ward on top of that. You also get a crazy amount of mana regen that scales with the amount of mana you have, and then also just a flat like 250 ward per second just for existing. And then to top it all off, there's the node Lost Knowledge, which has been nerfed like 3 times now to my knowledge. Basically every time you cast a skill that costs 40 mana, which is your Glacier and your Static Orb, you're just generating like hundreds and 500-600 ward per cast. This node is also really crazy. So the ward generation is off the charts on this build, and there's a ton of ways to leverage the mana. So I'm going to quickly go over the skills and some of the choices associated with them, and then after that we're going to go over the gearing. First up here is going to be teleport. This is very important to get the mana tunnel node. Essentially your teleport is serving as a free cast of your Static Orb, which costs 20% of your mana each time. So having the teleport here giving you a free cast can increase your DPS a lot on bosses because you have an extra cast of your Static Orb. Past that, you're looking to get the cooldown as low as possible, so you go the left tree route down here. Also gives you stun immunity. You bring the cooldown a ton, and it is very good. Meteor serves as your main clearing mechanism in monoliths. The way this combo works is you use Glacier as a mana generating skill. You don't know, there's a node down here which gives you % of max mana whenever Glacier crits, and this works per hit of Glacier. And if you have a large amount of max mana, it eventually goes positive against the mana cost of Glacier, which is 45. And if you're running around in the monolith, you can use this to proc the Harbinger of Stars belt, and it also gives you mana so you can static orb a bunch of rares and objectives inside the monolith. The meteors here can get pretty insane because it scales with the density around you. So if you have really dense packs, the meteors are going to be popping off. And additionally, this is going to be getting better on the patch because of the introduction of the new spark charge nodes. There's these funny nodes down at the bottom here, which gives you a guaranteed spark charge with 40 mana, which is of course going to be proccing with both of your skills, Glacier and Static Orb. When it hits a big pack, they're going to cause another spell cast, which can cause another crit, which can cause another meteor, effectively doubling the amount of meteors that you're going to be able to cast with this sort of setup. Additionally, Static Orb hits many times with the Scatter Blast node, and it is causing a spark charge to spawn off of every single hit of the Scatter Blast, causing more and more spells to hit per cast of your Static Orb. So these nodes down here are definitely super crazy. Anyways, we're going to move on to Static Orb from the skills here. I've talked about most of the nodes here already. It's just more damage per mana, more damage per mana. You make it hit 5 times instead of 1. And then there are just some pretty good more multipliers down here and a ton of crit multi you can pick up. Moving on is going to be Flame Ward. Now, I am a huge Flame Ward enjoyer. I'm a huge proponent of this skill. Normally during mapping, you can put on focus here, but I think if you're just running around in the monolith, I think you can drop focus and just put on Flame Ward instead. I think you're casting Scatter Blast a lot less often and you're running a lot less. I think you can definitely get away with the Flame Ward. And so you can take the Flame Ward on stun and grab the double charge with all the reduced damage. Flame Ward is just crazy. I don't need to talk about it. I'm sure you all know how good this skill is. And then lastly, as mentioned earlier, Glacier is simply just a vehicle for Harbinger of Stars to proc the meteors, as well as a big mana generation skill when you're running around in the monolith. Now let's go over the gearing here. The first strange thing you might see here is the Marina's Lost Soul, and there's just one reason for this, and that is because it has a substantial amount of base spell damage. We don't necessarily care what type of spell damage it is because we are scaling generic spell damage via stuff like intelligence as well as spell damage on Joras. We don't have any element specific damage, so the necrotic damage on this is going to go very far. There are other options in the wand slot. Wrong Warp is definitely an option, albeit nerfed on the 1.1 patch. You're basically going to be competing against Wrong Warp or Marina's Lost Soul. These are the two items I would go. Slam a T7 crit multi and a T5 mana. You also can consider going T7 mana and then T5 crit multi. That's also an option as well. As for the helmet, Peak of the Mountain is pretty much indispensable here. It is really impossible to crit cap on this build without this helmet because every single prefix is going to be being eaten up by mana and crit multi. And so where you normally be getting crit chance, it's just going to be eaten by mana and crit multi instead. So you pretty much are forced to put on this helmet to get crit capped. And then obviously for slams, you want level of Static Orb and mana. Those are the two most important ones. If you somehow get a 3LP, slam increased armor on it. Strong Mind is best in slots simply just because it has mana on it, and it is also a very easy target for 4LP. These things pop up pretty frequently in Merchant's Guild. You can just pick up a 4LP and slam your guaranteed stats on it, and then it just gives you basically 60 additional mana on top of your 140 slam that you get, and you can put resistances on the suffixes you want as well. The Catalyst is very necessary here. This is where you get your base crit chance. You're going to want to make that the highest roll possible. The 6 base crit on the implicit is absolutely the most important thing on this item. And then past that, of course, mana, crit multi on the prefixes as mentioned before, and then try and get some resistances on the suffixes. Star Dial, you teleport, you get 150 int or whatever, it's crazy. Gives you mana spent as ward, gives you mana on the implicits, gives you spell damage. These rings are going to be the GG damage rings for sure. There are other options like red rings. You're basically going to be putting on some combo of Joras, Osherion, or red ring, one of the three. I'm just going with Joras because they are the highest damage option for sure. Harbingers of Stars, and you want a T7 slam on the seconds of traversal skill cooldowns on potion use, and then chance to find potions is probably the second most important mod because you do have heavy reliance on those potions, and then also you can put armor or something like that on the suffixes if you can fit it. There's two reasons why the potions here are important, and one of them is because we're using a Grimoire of Necrotic Elixirs, which gives us 40 necrotic damage to spells on potion use, so that's another 40 spell damage that's, we very much need. Additionally, this lets you reduce your cooldown of your teleport so that you can get another free cast. This just provides a pretty, comfortable loop while mapping. You can pick up some pots, chug them to reset your teleport, get a free cast of your Static Orb. It just feels super nice while you're running around in the monolith. And then last but not least, we have Eternal Gauntlet so that we can get some dot mitigation, of course, T7 mana wherever possible. And then of course, you need a drain mod somewhere to enable ward from healing hands from your your Paladin as well as your Void Knight. As for the idols, you just want armor mana suffixes with lightning crit to cap out your static orb because you're just shy of hitting the cap. And then also you can get AoE on the prefixes here as well. Mana is also a very good prefix here if you're trying to get some, starter idols before you have these. It's just, ideally you get the crit chance here just so that you can cap out your crit. Just know that mana is an option on the prefix here as well. Rest of the idols is just capping res. Blessing is going to be crit multi, mana, res, armor. That's all standard stuff there. Now, there is one thing to mention in that there is a pretty potent gear swap you can do when you're doing bosses in order to amp your single target or sustained damage. Now, if you use static orb and you dump all of your static orbs, you run out of mana, that's it. You have to kind of wait for your mana to come back. That's obviously not great. In single target situations, I think the best thing to do is obviously put focus on your bar, and I think the best thing to do is hot swap your flame ward for bosses or regular monolith. The most important nodes to take here on focus is grabbing the out of mana nodes here and the out of mana nodes down there. The focus buff comes through on the patch. You're going to be able to get, I think, 60% of your max mana instantly when you channel for 1 second. And obviously this allows you to once again dump all of your mana for more static orbs, which generates you a ton more ward, etc., etc. On top of that, if you use the focus when you're out of mana, it will be proccing your transient rest, which gives you a fuck ton of ward because you're missing all of your mana, because we're converting it into a traversal skill here. Now, on top of the fact that it is a traversal skill now, we can use the belt mod to then lower the cooldown via potions. So during a boss scenario, you can basically dump all of your mana, focus to get 60% of your mana back, dump all of it again, chug as many potions as you need to get your focus cooldown back, 60% mana, dump more static orbs until you're out of potions. But to be honest, there probably aren't very many things in the game that's going to be able to tank this much damage because everything is honestly just evaporated by static orb. So basically, if you're doing like super high corruption shades or some kind of pinnacle boss, you can put on focus, spec the out of mana nodes that are over here, and then put on a jungle queen so you have a ton of potions in the bank that you can reduce the cooldown of focus with, so you have a huge mana pool in reserve. And yeah, that's the basics of the mana stacker. It is super high damage. It's crazy how high the damage of this build is. There are some survivability concerns on this build. I have built this fairly glass cannon, but you can kind of pull back the damage a little bit, bring in some more armor, bring in some mechanics like dodge, that kind of thing. But because I am not hosting the monoliths, I don't actually really care if I die. And I expect in a party the bosses to all be stun locked because they haven't made sufficient changes to prevent the stun locking of bosses. So you're allowed to just go full glass cannon. If you die in the monolith, that's kind of whatever. And basically the bosses aren't going to be moving because you have supports that are CC locking them down. Speaking of supports, let's move on to the Paladin build here. Now, we played Paladin to 3000 corruption before we got bored and quit last cycle. And we all said to ourselves at the end of 1.0 that holy fuck, is Healing Hands going to get nerfed? And oh boy, did it get nerfed. It was generating something like 45,000 ward per second or something along those lines. And now it's going to be generating you maybe like 4,000 to 5,000 on the top end with like very best gear, which is still acceptable, but it might not be the only source of EHP you want to rely on. And so we've modified this to have a little bit less healing effectiveness, a little bit less ward retention, as well as brought in a healthy HP pool and tried to cap out dodge as well as endurance via the foot of the mountain. So first things first, let's go over all of the skills on the support and why supports are so good in this game. And we have to begin with Volatile Reversal. This skill is the best skill in last Epoch. Hands down, nothing comes close to this skill. If you're unaware, it's just an AoE skill you use, and you can make it have an explosion at the end of the skill, and you can also have an explosion at the beginning of the skill. There's nodes down here which make it so when mobs get hit by that explosion, they take damage, increased damage, which is effectively a more multiplier. It adds together with all other increased damage taken sources, but it is a more multiplier. But technically it has diminishing returns with other sources of increased damage, yada yada, whatever. But the really cool thing about this is that it stacks with itself, and it's per hit of the explosion. So because there are two explosions, this turns this node into 60% increased damage taken. Not only that, it stacks with itself when you get a bunch of cooldown reduction, and the base cooldown here can be lowered a fuck ton via these nodes here and these nodes here. With enough investment on the tree as well as CDR rolls on your belt and boots, you can get the cooldown to like 2 seconds or something like that, which means you have an overlapping buff of potentially 120% increased damage taken, which that alone would justify the existence of a support, because essentially 120% increased damage taken is more than doubling your damage. And adding another person to the party doesn't necessarily double the HP of the mobs. On top of that, volatile reversal stacks among party members, so you can have a second person casting it, which is what the Void Knight is doing, and some other stuff which we'll get to. Next up is Shield Bash. It's just going to be a super nice CC that you can use during the mono, during bosses. You don't have this on your bar because you have Shield Rush while you're running through monoliths. You have this spec'd and ready to go for when you need to go kill a shade or you kill a boss, because it is a very nice CC. Sigils of Hope just has a ton of increased damage over here. You can get 5 max sigils by coming down here and then up here, and you can get it insta-cast so that the Paladin doesn't need to slow down. Healing Hands is still very much worth scaling on the Paladin. Essentially, you just hold the button down with the channeling node so it casts 4 times per second. You stack a fuck ton of healing effectiveness, converted all the ward, and you get like 5k ward per second, which is very good. Last but not least is Holy Aura. This gives us some crit chance as well as some needed crit multi. Gives you a ton of resistances, a slow on activation, increased dodge chance, health regen, and then poison, resin, cleansing ailments. Like everything about the Holy Aura is super good. Let's go over the gearing now. So we're still going for the gearing tried and true, which is Cleaver Solution, Bastion of Honor. This combo is super sick and it makes you super tanky because you can stack strength on the cleaver, get a ton of armor from it, convert all of that strength also to block, and all of that armor from the strength gets also converted to int, which serves as your source of ward retention. It's like triple dipping stats here when you equip these 2 items on a support. It's very, very efficient and impossible to beat, frankly. So you're going to want to put parry chance on T7 here. It's just an extra stat, extra defensive layer, and then chance to shred armor on hit, which you're going to be doing with the Healing Hands here. One thing to mention here is the Paladin is being built like a brick because we're planning on having him host the monoliths or the echoes. The reason for that is the host cannot die during the monolith or else you do not get stability. If the host survives and everybody else dies and just comes back in, everybody gets stability. So it is imperative for the host to be the tankiest and not die. And so building this character as tanky as possible is definitely in your purview. Moving on, we got the helmet. It's just getting some CDR for the volatile reversal, of course, attunement for some healing effectiveness. Additionally, it's getting level of Healing Hands just to take some more nodes, healing effectiveness, and it's also building health suffixes. The amulet, you're going to see an Oracle amulet because damage over time is a huge nuisance in the end game. So Oracle base here is definitely recommended. Healing effect, dodge rating, and dodge rating on the Exalted. The reason for all of the dodge rating is because when you're moving, you have a pretty good dodge chance at 58, but when you're standing still, casting Healing Hands, all of your dodge rating is going to be getting converted to endurance threshold here, which means you have capped endurance on your health bar here. When you're standing still, the endurance threshold is at 3000. We also have capped endurance here, which is normally 60%. So you have 58% chance to dodge while moving. You have capped block, capped endurance while standing still. You have nearly capped armor, 73% mitigation. You have every mechanic under the sun that makes you tanky. On top of that, you're going to be sitting on like 10, 12k ward maybe, as well as 2.9k health. You have everything, all the tools you need to survive. Red ring is just for more DR. Of course, you want to be more tanky. If you're going to put slams on these, it's going to be healing effectiveness. And then of course, CDR, health on belt. You want dot mitigation gloves with a drain mod to enable the Healing Hands mod, health, and then healing effectiveness, armor mitigation applies to damage over time. That's all very self-explanatory. The idols are going to be healing effect, block effectiveness. This is where the majority of your block effectiveness comes from. The blessings are just all defensive blessings here, which is crit avoidance, dodge rating, block chance, block effect, and then shred because we're doing majority lightning damage with static orb, our main skill. That's it for the Paladin. There aren't very many substitutions you can make here for gear. I think this is by far the most efficient and tanky you can make the Paladin, basically. And that means we can move on to the Void Knight, which has a near identical setup of gear, because honestly, it is a very similar character, but it has a bunch of other stuff on its bar. So let's talk about the skills. Of course, we are casting Volatile Reversal because it stacks. So we put another one in the party, of course. Next up is going to be Shield Throw. There's some really crazy nodes up here in Shield Throw, which give you 500 armor to allies when you hit them with the shield. And then there's a node behind here, which was previously bugged, which gives you effect of this armor per attunement rating, which you have 82 attunement. So this node here is going to be giving you like 6k flat armor to all of your allies that you hit with the shield, which basically instantly caps them if they have any source of increased armor anywhere. It is super trivial to cap out. The rest of the nodes is just giving you extra ricochets as well as making the cooldown 0. Healing Hands tree is going to be very similar, taking all the ward nodes on the left. You do not take the ward over time nodes here because because it does not stack, so only one person in the party needs it. Instead, you take these points and dump them over here, which lets you take less void damage taken as well as less necrotic damage taken. Next up is Javelin. It's just a huge increased damage you can provide to your party. It's 2% damage per attunement, so it's going to be like 180% increased damage to all of your allies, which is a pretty hefty boost. And then last but not least is going to be Anomaly. Now, Anomaly was nerfed and it no longer stun locks bosses, so the main abuse case for Void Knight was taken away, but you can still hot swap on a shield bash and put on stun duration relics if you're wishing to stun lock bosses in a party. So you can take shield bash, take all the stun duration, and then put on stun idols here, put on stun gear. You can still easily perma stun bosses if you have two people rotating stuns. But the main use case for Anomaly here is just going to be the massive amount of team buffs you get at the bottom right here. Essentially, you cast it, it gives you a time bubble. The time bubble lasts for 10 seconds. It gives you 120% crit, 20% attack and cast speed, 30% CDR, which by the way, increases the amount of volatile reversals you can shit out, which is increasing the amount of damage the mob is taking. Finally, it's just reducing the cooldown and making it so it's insta-cast. So the builds between the VK and the Paladin are pretty identical, except for one runs, this set of skills, which is Holy Aura and Sigils, and then one is going to be running Javelin and Anomaly. You can rotate the Javelin over to the Paladin because both of you are building a hefty amount of attunement, so you can kind of switch these skills around, but you're going to want all 10 of these skills somewhere on the bar between these two players. As for the gearing, it is literally identical to the Paladin. It is just a few adjustments here because you want to get level of Anomaly so you can get the cooldown and the insta-cast. That is very important. Otherwise, you're going to be building all of the exact same shit here. It's just the best way to make this character a brick, and so you'll just want to be following the same gear pathing here. Now, let's talk about leveling all of these builds. First off, I have linked a filter in the description that has basically all of the leveling rules as well as all of the end game rules. You can feel free to use it if you'd like. You can modify it however you want, turn rules on and off. It's there if you want it. But first off, we're going to be talking about leveling the Sorc. Now, first couple levels, you're running around with Fireball, Lightning Blast, it's whatever. You can spec whatever you want. You're going to want Elemental Nova at level 4. You're going to be using that for a few levels, but you're going to get Glacier at level 6 here, and you're going to be using that and never looking back. I'm going to be including max roll leveling planners down in the description as well. You can click on any of the passives or the skills on any of the classes, and there is a slider down here that you can slide. It'll show you exactly which order to take the skills in while leveling, as well as the entire passive tree, which I've recommended you spec in which order. As for the skills on Glacier, you're taking the mana efficiency first, which are these nodes here. You're taking a bunch of the hit damage, which is at the top right. You're taking the final hit damage, which is down here. It's all pretty self-explanatory. Second skill you're going to be picking up is going to be Focus. Now, it's imperative to take the mana regen here, but not the out of mana focus to increase the cooldown. You're taking that later, but not early. Focus is getting a huge buff on the patch, which is giving it an additional 10% of missing mana that it didn't have before. So it's going to be feeling a lot better, and I personally think it's better in a group than Mana Strike is. Third up, you're going to be specializing Static Orb. You're going to be going a slightly different spec than what you're doing for the end game. You want to make it cost like exactly 40 mana, and the reason for that is you don't have a lot of mana early, but you specifically want to make it cost more than 40 mana with 1 point here in mana charge so that you can proc the spark charges here because the skill costs more than 40 mana. That is very imperative here. Next up, Flame Ward. I've talked about this. Just grab the double charges, cast when stun. It feels really good while leveling. This should all be self-explanatory. Last is going to be Teleport. It's going to be the exact same as the end game tree. While leveling, you want to pick up the best staff for your level. The flat spell damage on the implicit is much more important than any of the explicit affixes, so always pick up the best staff for your level. Around level 38 or 45 or something like that, you want to start looking out for these Osprix skulls because that is when you're going to be transitioning to a wand and a catalyst. This is the way you get your base crit, is this catalyst, so you need to make sure to be looking for this Osprix skull or a crystal skull if you're getting higher level, and then you're looking for a wand with high base damage. Other than that, just try to fill out your leveling gear with just spell damage or any kind of resistances or health that you can get your hands on. Leveling the Paladin and more largely the Void Knight, it's just going to be taking Hammer Throw early. Just take the orbiting hammers for the first like 10, maybe 20 levels, and then you can start to transition into the support build because all you really need to do is get your mastery, which is Paladin or Void Knight, put 5 points into Void Knight for volatile reversal, and boom, you're pulling your weight. You can play a real build and then respec later, but with just having volatile reversal on your bar, getting all the extra utility from the other skills, it's just going to pull its weight with just the skills on the bar. You're just taking defenses on the tree, grabbing a bunch of attunement, grabbing all of the stuff, gives you healing effect, and then just personal defenses across the board all the way in Forge Guard. It's very self-explanatory here. Essentially, the Paladin and the Void Knight serve as runners in the monoliths and the campaign. You're going to want to take Shield Rush on your bar early and just try to run through the campaign as fast as possible. And that way, the Sorcs can warp in on you via the party frames that appear at the top left, and you can breeze through the campaign and early monoliths. But yeah, that about covers everything for leveling on the build. I'm also going to be including a few alternate party builds if you're interested. I do think Stygian Coal Lich is going to be very strong on the patch. You can honestly play the support builds with any number of builds, and you can provide all of the aforementioned utility to them as well. So in the description, I'll just link a few suggestions for other builds or other carries you might want to play with these supports. Additionally, last but not least, I have updated the Druid support build. This is still very viable and gives your teammates a fuck ton of flat spell damage that's hard to get, as well as a ton of dodge. It's just something that you can bring to the table, but with the state of volatile reversal in the state that it is now, it is tough to justify playing the Druid support in the current landscape of the game. Basically, volatile reversal exists, everything else is just walking in its shadow. But if you're looking into the Druid support, I'll leave a link down there as well. Anyways, if you have any questions about the builds or anything like that, I'm always happy to answer them if you just leave them in the comments. We are going to be streaming the 1.1 cycle start on Tuesday here. I'll be streaming that on Twitch, so keep out a lookout for that. But yeah, once again, I'm Snap, and thanks for watching.